Now, if you're a parent, hands up for parents. There you go. You and I all share the same frustration, and it's all linked to this question. What did you do at school today? Who's asked that question to their child? What is the response that comes back? It's always the same. The response is nothing. You ask this question, what did you do at school today? And the response that comes back is nothing. And then you respond with something similar along the lines of, well, you've been at school for that entire day. Surely you must have done something. Is that just me? I'm sure we all do this. And when I say that to my kids, I hear my parents in me and I go, oh no. And then I have to phone up my mum again and apologize for all of those sort of things. What did you do at school today? Nothing. The reality is I recognize I have to give my kids a little bit of slack for doing this, because people ask me a similar question, not what did I do at school today. Sometimes people will say, well, how's your week? Actually, most Sundays, somebody will say to me, how was your week? And I will stand there with a blank look on my face as I try and think about, well, how was my week? What did I do this week? Nothing stands out. Do you ever have those moments? People ask you a similar question and you're left wondering, well, what actually did I do? As you look back, well, how was my week? Was it a good week? Was it a bad week? And you're left with sort of like, well, I don't really know, because I can't really remember anything from that. Maybe that's just me and a side of the age that I'm getting to. The thing is, often my week is just normal. There wasn't anything that was spectacular and there wasn't anything that was horrific. It was just average. It was just ordinary. It was just normal. We often measure our lives on the highs and the lows. As we look back over our lives, we look at those those mountaintop moments, and we also see those sort of low, those valley moments, those dark moments in our life. And hopefully there's more high moments than low moments. And we look back and then we sort of measure our lives based on all the really good things or based on the really terrible things. I think, well, have I had a really good life or have I had a really awful life? But the reality is the majority of life is just flat. It's not a mountaintop. It's not a valley. It's just the plains. It's just normal. It's just average. And the same is true in my relationship with God. There's those moments when it's like a mountaintop experience, and maybe when life is going really well and I can see God is with me, or I feel really close to God. Jamie talking about Satellites Festival, for many young people, is a mountaintop moment. They spend a week there and they experience or they encounter God in a way that they've never encountered him before. It feels like they're on top of a mountain. But then there's also those valley moments when maybe God seems distant, or it seems you can't understand what God is doing, or you can't hear from God, or you feel just disconnected from God. Or maybe it's like that valley moment because life is difficult. You're in the pits of despair and everything is crumbling down around you. Everything is crashing down. Life is just difficult and life is just challenging. And in those moments you think, well, is God there? And actually for me, I'm often aware of God being with me in those valley moments more than the mountaintop moments. I can see God's love and God's faithfulness that he sticks there with me. But again, the reality is most of my relationship with God isn't a mountaintop experience. It's not a valley. It's just flat. It's just normal. It's just average. Where is God when everything is ticking over? Where is God in the midst of the ordinary? Well, that's what we're going to look at today as we wrap up this series called Choosing Love. We've been exploring the story of Ruth, which you can find in the Old Testament. It's a really short book. It's just 4 chapters. And each week we've been unpacking and exploring each of those chapters. So today we're looking at Ruth chapter 4. If you've missed any of these messages, you can catch up as ever online on our YouTube channel or through fbcnext.com. And basically what's happened is Ruth is a Moabite. She's from Moab, and she married the son of a lady called Naomi. Naomi was from Bethlehem, and Ruth's husband dies, as does his husband's brother, as does her husband's father, which basically leaves Ruth as a widow, but it leaves Naomi without a husband and without any sons. And this was not a good situation to find yourself in the midst of the ancient world. All prosperity and hope and status actually came through sons or through husbands. So if you were a woman without a husband and without any sons, you would be pretty destitute and in trouble. horrible. And there's famine in the land, so Naomi decides to go home to Bethlehem. And in this amazing act of loyalty, Ruth chooses to go with her. She leaves her homeland and she goes to a foreign land where she's an alien, where she's a stranger, where the practices and the customs are not the same as back home. And she shows such love and devotion and loyalty to Naomi. But the problem is they arrive in Bethlehem. They've got no source of income, they've got no source of food, they've got no way to look after themselves. So Ruth goes out to glean in the fields. It's harvest times, and gleaning was a practice that God actually said to the nation of Israel, when you collect in the harvest, don't harvest your fields right up to the edges, and as you go through the harvest, if you drop stuff, leave it so that the people who are poor or the foreigner can come and collect things after you. So Ruth did that. And she fortunately found her way to Boaz's field. Boaz was a man of noble standing in the community. He's also related to Naomi, or to Elimelech, who is Naomi's husband. And lots of stuff happened. And in chapter 3, basically, in a little bit of a scandalous way, Ruth goes and proposes to Boaz. You need to read the story or catch up if you haven't seen it or unaware of it. And we're going to pick up the story right at the beginning of Ruth chapter 4. And it says this: Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Now this is all about a guardian redeemer is somebody, again in Jewish family, in Jewish law, if you are poor or if you've lost land or you're in need, your relative or your closest relative has a responsibility to look after you. And when Ruth comes and basically proposes to Boaz, he does so because he is a guardian redeemer of Naomi. He's related to Naomi. But Boaz says, well, there's somebody else. There's somebody else who's a closer relative. He must have the option to marry you first. So he goes and speaks to this guy. That's what's going on. So Boaz said to the guy, come here, my friend, and sit down. So he went over and sat down. So you can picture the scene, Boaz with this other guy that, just sitting in the marketplace or wherever they are. And Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here. And they did so. And at this point, this other guy knows that something's going on. So taking 10 elders or 10 people is a sign that some transaction's about to take place. So this is what makes what's about to happen legal. These other witnesses are witnesses to what's about to happen. So this guy knows this isn't just an average conversation. Boaz is not just having a coffee with him and just catching up and talking about the football. He's about to try and do some business with him. So he says, then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who's come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. Now, let me give you a little tip here. If you know when you're in maybe you're in a small group and you're reading through chapters of the Bible and you do that thing that you used to do at school when you do reading, when everyone will read a bit and then you move around. And do you do that in small groups? Some people do that. What tends to happen when you do that is you're not listening to anyone else because you're looking forward to what bit am I going to read? And then you're like, oh no, I've got the one with the really hard names. If you come across a name or a word that you don't know how to pronounce, just say it with boldness and confidence, even if it's completely wrong. Everybody will go along with you. So there you go. And it came to our relative Steve. And I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of the seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you're not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I'm next in line. I will redeem it, he says. Now, this is a bit strange because Boaz is going to this guy to talk to him about marrying Ruth. And what's going on here is that, so Naomi has this land, she's got no money, so she needs to sell it to get some income. And again, in Jewish law and tradition and customs, they don't want to sort of basically get rid of land. They want to keep it in the family and these sort of things. So this guy, being the guardian redeemer, being the closest relative, has the first opportunity to buy the land. And that's the sort of the transaction that is taking place. And he's like, yeah, okay. I've got land already. I can always do with a little bit more that would add to my inheritance. It will add to my estate. So I will do it. But there's a little bit more, as we know, that's going on. Then Boaz says, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. Well, this is all of a sudden, this is sort of changed. This man had the first right to buy Naomi's property because he was the guardian redeemer, because he was a close relative. So if he wants to play that trump card and say, yeah, I will acquire that property, he's also got to carry through with the responsibility of the guardian redeemer and marry Naomi's, the widow of Naomi's son, which is Ruth. Now, this goes all the way back to Deuteronomy, book of the law. There's loads of stuff that outlined in it. And it says this in chapter 25, verse 5 and 6. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. And this is why I rejoiced when my nephew Zach was born, so that I wouldn't have to. It sounded funny. But obviously, my wife told me not to make that joke, and I should have listened to her. You see the whole scene. So if you marry someone and then if you're a bloke and you die, or you're a widow and you've not had a son, your husband's brother or closest relative needs to fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to give you a son so that the family name will carry on. And actually, so the son that is born in this context actually belongs to the dead man, and his name carries on and his line carries on. So that sort of family will take the estate and inheritance and all this sort of stuff. So it's very complicated, and it's a very different thing going on than this guy originally thought. The guardian redeemer said, well, then I can't redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. Now, and what's going on here is that there's probably two reasons why this guy refuses to do it. Perhaps he doesn't really know Ruth. He's heard of Ruth and all those sort of things. But he's worried because he might endanger his own estate. I mean, that's the reason why you get married or don't get married, isn't it? I'm not going to get married because I don't want to endanger my own estate. It doesn't really make sense in our culture or our context. This guy, there's probably two main reasons why he chooses not to go through with this. Perhaps he doesn't have any sons at all. And then through marrying Ruth and giving birth to a son or bearing her a son, his inheritance, his estate, would get lumped up into the son of Ruth's. And it would go through like the line of Elimelech and Ruth's husband, that they would inherit the estate there. And actually, his estate would be at risk. Or perhaps, and this is probably more likely, he's got lots of sons. And actually, by then marrying Ruth and marrying into that family, he could put his estate at risk because, he'd get some benefit from buying the land, but not a lot. But then his estate gets mixed in and it basically gets watered down, it gets diminished. And he's like, well, actually, this doesn't make much economical sense for me to marry Ruth and to acquire the land. So I'm not going to do it. So he says to Boaz, and we don't even know this guy, we don't know anything about him other than he chooses not to go through there. He says to Boaz, well, you redeem it because I can't. So let's jump on a bit. Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have brought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. Now that's Ruth's dead husband. I've also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today, you are witnesses. It's such a romantic story, isn't it? There's a tear in your eye as people are watching it. It's just weird. It's just strange. It's transactional. It's all about economics and all of those sort of things. It doesn't make much sense to us. But what is amazing is what Boaz has done. Actually, he could have said, no, I don't have to do this. I don't have to follow through with this. Boaz has gone above and beyond in his loyalty and the way that he's protected and provided for Ruth and for Naomi. He sort of stands out head and shoulders above the rest. He's shown such loyalty to Ruth and to Naomi. And Boaz was moved by the loyalty that Ruth had shown to Naomi. And this is a key theme that runs throughout the whole book of Ruth. And as we read on, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive. And she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." And the contrast that we see, as we sort of begin to wrap up the story of Ruth, it is vast. Right at the beginning of the story, Naomi loses everything. She loses her husband. She loses her sons. And so she decides to go back home. And at the end of chapter 1, she says to Ruth, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara." She changes her name. Mara means bitter. And she's like, because God is punishing me. God is afflicting me. God is making my life more difficult. And Naomi is very negative at the start of the story, and you can understand why. That she's in a valley moment. She's in the pits of despair, and she's wondering where God is. God's left me. God's abandoned me. Actually, more than that, God is doing this to punish me, or God is afflicting me. God is making my life difficult. And then when we contrast that with the end of the story, we see something very different. She's blessed. Ruth has came and looked after her. Ruth has helped her. Ruth chose to go with her to Bethlehem. What would have happened to Naomi if Ruth didn't choose to go to Bethlehem with her? Naomi would have had no source of income. She had sons and they died. The guardian redeemer wouldn't have had to marry her because she did have sons, even though they died. She would have been in a really difficult state. But that doesn't happen because Ruth goes with her. And the people say, your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. This is some statement. Because again, remember, in this culture, in this context, it's all about sons. Daughters have no status. Everybody wants to give birth to a son because there's power in there. There's recognition, there's income, there's prosperity that comes through that. Daughters are a bargaining chip. Really. And again, that's difficult for us to get our heads around. But Ruth is better than 7 sons. And this number 7 is important in throughout the Bible. It symbolizes perfection. That Ruth is the perfect son. She's better than all of these things. Naomi's life is completely different. Things have turned around completely from how it started at the beginning. And then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. And he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This is an interesting thing because what seems to happen here is, Naomi didn't just take the child as a grandmother and look after her and sort of, I'll watch him for a little bit so you can sleep and all that sort of stuff. The woman living there said, Naomi has a son. That actually it seems that Boaz and Ruth gave their son to Naomi. That Naomi, and it's sort of like, it's not just a grandmother, that actually she's an adoptive or a surrogate mother to Obed. And Obed now can look after Naomi and provide for him. Now, the cynics among us will say, well, the reason Boaz did that is because, just like the other guy, he didn't want it, this is quite astute. By giving Obed to Naomi, then actually Obed will inherit Naomi's line and her estate and Elimelech's and all that sort of stuff. And Boaz's stuff is left protected. That actually is not at risk. The more gracious of us will see that this is an act of amazing generosity, an act of amazing love and devotion, that by taking the son and giving it to Naomi, actually they're ensuring that Naomi is looked after and cared for and protected. And actually this is even more amazing when we consider that perhaps Ruth couldn't have children in the first place. We don't hear of Ruth and Boaz having any more children. Ruth didn't have a son through Mahlon before. And actually, it said that the Lord enabled Ruth to conceive. Perhaps she couldn't have children. Perhaps Obed is a miracle baby, and they take that miracle and that they give it to Naomi. There's so many amazing things going on in this story, but there's so many things that we just can't understand, so many things that we can't comprehend or get our head around. This story is set thousands of miles away and thousands of years ago, or as my daughter Leah said, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away for the Star Wars fans. We don't understand this. We can't comprehend it. This world is not our world. The world of Ruth's is not the world that we live in today. And to us, these events are strange. They're extraordinary, but perhaps the most extraordinary thing is how ordinary these events are. These events, believe it or not, are part of everyday life, part of everyday culture. It's just stuff that goes out. What stands out are the actions of Ruth and Boaz, but the scene is everyday. This is just normal life. It's how things are. There's one person, as you flick through the pages of Ruth, and there's loads of stuff that's inspiring, and this loyalty, and this love, and this devotion. It's an inspiring book, but there's somebody who seems absent. There's somebody who seems quiet. There's somebody who doesn't seem to be doing a lot, and that is God. God is mentioned in the book of Ruth, but not really directly. He doesn't really seem to be doing anything. He's referred to, but we don't see God doing anything. There's no divine revelation. There's no sort of orchestration. We don't see God at work. We don't see God moving. We just see these people going through their everyday lives, doing their normal things. And as we zoom out, we can see something amazing happening. But if we zoom into the midst of the situation, they're just going through life. They're just doing whatever they would do. It's just a normal Monday, a normal Tuesday, a normal Wednesday. It's just part of life in the ancient world. God doesn't seem to be doing stuff. And Ruth and Boaz seem intent on acting in a way that is consistent with the values of Yahweh. That's how they referred to God. They seem intent on ensuring that what they do is done with integrity, that it's done in a way that reflects the greatness of who God is. But God doesn't seem to say anything. God doesn't seem to do anything. God doesn't seem to move anything. Life is just happening, and it's just going on. The end of the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy, and we sort of read a little bit of it just a moment ago. And it says this: Salmon, the father of Boaz, Boaz, the father of Obed, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David. You see, David was one of the greatest kings in the nation of Israel. And Obed is David's grandfather. He's a great person in the nation of history. And actually, the genealogy goes back to the forefathers, showing how actually this is part of a bigger story. This is part of a bigger plan. But as we zoom past David, we see that Jesus is a descendant of David. The whole point of this, and I think a key theme in the book of Ruth, a key thing that we can take from it is, life is full of up and downs. Life has its highs and its lows, but most of life is everyday. Most of life is normal. Most of life is ordinary. And God is there in the highs. God is there in those mountaintop moments. God is there when you feel really close to him and you can sense his presence, and maybe you can hear him and you can see he's at work and you can feel him. And God is there in those low moments, in those valley moments. God is there when everything is crashing down around you and you're aware of his love and his faithfulness and him sustaining you and helping you. Even though the situation or the circumstances might not be changing, you can still sense that God is there and he's holding you and he's keeping you going. But God is also there in the midst of the ordinary. God is there in the daily routine. God is there when you get out of bed and you go and have the same thing for breakfast that you've had every single day for the last 3 years. God is there when you clean your teeth and you get ready and put your work clothes on. God is there when you climb into your car and you do the commute and to drop the kids off at school or wherever it is that you're going to your place of work. God is there as you go and buy your ticket to get on the train and you sit in the same seat in the same carriage, listening to the same podcast or whatever it is. God is there in the midst of the everyday. God is there in the midst of the ordinary. And as we look at the story of Ruth, there was no divine intervention as it seems. That no angel appeared to Naomi and says, this is what's going to happen. Go back to Bethlehem and I will provide for you and I will look after you. An angel appeared to somebody else in that context, in that story. Ruth doesn't have a dream the night before she goes out to glean in the fields of Boaz to instruct her where to go to turn right instead of turning left. She just goes about her stuff. A prophet doesn't appear to Boaz and says, you should marry the daughter-in-law of Naomi and do all these things. These people are just doing what they thought they should do in the midst of the everyday, ordinary situations of life. The book of Matthew starts, just like the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy, the book of Matthew starts with a genealogy, talking about the line of Jesus. And right in the middle of it, towards the beginning of it, we read this: Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. And as we go through this, we see that Jesus is there. That Boaz is the father of Obed. Actually, there's only a couple of women named in the genealogies. Ruth is one of them that gets a mention. In this book that seems a bit strange to us because we don't understand the culture or the context, but actually in the culture and context, it's just normal. It's just everyday life. This book where God doesn't seem to be doing anything. He doesn't seem to be intervening. He doesn't seem to be moving. He doesn't seem to be helping. Through all of that, we see this, that Boaz becomes the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, that they become descendants of Jesus, that Jesus is a descendant of them, that they become part of his line. And when we zoom out, we see, oh my word, God, look what you were doing. Look how you were orchestrating. Look how you were moving. But when you zoom in, it's difficult to see that. That's my experience of life and faith. That often when I zoom out with the benefit of hindsight, I can see, yeah, God, I can see that how you've enabled me to be here and how these things are fitted together. And I think that's more than a coincidence. I can see that you're at work when I zoom out and I see the bigger picture. But when I'm in the midst of the everyday, just doing the normal, mundane, ordinary things, it can be really difficult to see where God is or what God is doing. And that's where we need to be like Ruth and Boaz, who in those situations just faithfully carry on living our lives in a way that reflects the values of who Jesus is. That, for those of us who have dedicated our lives to following Jesus, we need to live our lives in a way that Jesus would if he was in our shoes, whether we can feel him or see him or not. Whether we can hear him or it all seems quiet and we're wondering, well, what is it that you want me to do? Where is it that you want me to go? And there's just silence. In those moments, we need to faithfully just step out and continue to act and trust in God, continue to believe that he is faithful because we know that he is faithful. So where are you right now? Are you on top of a mountain? Is life going well and everything's sort of seeming to fit together? Is your relationship with God one of those mountaintop moments where you feel really close to God and you can sense his presence with you and he's inspiring you and encouraging you? Or are you in a valley? Is life difficult and challenging? Are you in the pits of despair and everything seems hard work? And maybe that feels like with God that you think, well, why are you allowing me to go through all this sort of stuff? Or maybe life is difficult and you can sense God with you, helping you, encouraging you, strengthening you. Or perhaps like most of us, you're just on the flat, ordinary plains of life, the everyday. You're just going through the mundane, ordinary stuff. I think that is true, is that when we take our ordinary lives and live them with God, he makes the ordinary extraordinary. And we might never know the impact of what God is doing right now. We might never know the impact of how God is moving and is at work in the midst of our ordinary life. And maybe that's not for us to know. For us, it's just to remain faithful to what God is doing. You know, if you're on our mailing list, you would received an email from me a few weeks ago or a month ago around International Women's Day. And I encourage you to, and I'm sure you know this, so I don't need to tell you about the email because you read them all and everything goes in. But I encourage you to say thank you to a woman who's had an impact on your life. And I told you the story of a lady called Mary. Mary was my youth leader when I first started going to church or going back to church. And Mary with her husband, Chris, opened up their home and invited us in. It was the first time that I sort of went to a place and started to discover a little bit about who God is and what it meant to follow him. And they fed me, they cared for me, they loved me. They took me away to Butlins, to Spring Harvest, and it was at that place that I made a life-transforming decision to follow Jesus. And I just sent Mary